This is one of two dressers that my parents bought my brother and I about 48 years ago. It was sold unfinished, which, apart from making it cheaper, gave you the opportunity to decide on the hardware and what finish you wanted. It's been used a lot and it's in great shape with the exception of this water stain on the top, but it's solid pine, so I'll just plane the stain off. Drawers are really solid and they work very well. They've got these great plastic brackets that glide on a wooden runner. It's quite a common system, but what makes these different is that the plastic part runs from the front to the back of the drawer, and that helps with the side-to-side stability. I don't love the Chippendale style drawer pulls, so I'm going to replace those. I get started by removing the hardware so that I can scrape and sand the finish off. Without the hardware, you can really see these Batman tan lines on the drawer fronts. And after I sand it, if it's possible, they seem even more pronounced. My plan involves covering them, but if you weren't going to do that, you probably could bleach them or sand them until they disappeared. I'm still using the dresser that my parents bought at the same time, and about 5 years ago I replaced the hardware. When I took it off, the tan lines were just as pronounced, but you'll notice that wherever the pine is light in color, the tan lines have bleached just with the sunlight, and wherever it's dark, you can still see them. A structural problem that I want to repair is this gap that's underneath each drawer. The face of the drawer is flush with the bottom of the drawer, so I'm going to be able to add a piece of wood to close that gap. While I'm preparing all the surfaces, I'm going to take the top off the dresser to make it easier to handle both the cabinet and the dresser top. I definitely don't like this scalloped detail at the bottom, but it is structural, and so when I take it off, I'm going to have to make sure that I replace it with something to hold the cabinet together properly. Using the table saw, I'm going to cut the sides and the back off the cabinet, equivalent to the depth of the scalloped piece that I just knocked off. So I have to make sure there are no nails or screws wherever the blade is going to run. The tops and bottoms of each of the drawer faces are rounded over, and in order for my plan to work, I need them to be at sharp right angles, so I'm cutting them off on the table saw. I cut some pine 1x about 3/8 of an inch thick so that I can glue it to the bottom and the sides of all the drawers. That solves the problem of the gap between the drawers. The top of the dresser is very flat, but I still need to plane it to get rid of that watermark. One pass wasn't enough to get rid of it, so I did a second pass. I had to be very careful with the sides because they're just veneer over particle board and it's easy to sand through them. My plan is to apply pine mosaic pieces to the faces of the drawers, and this is a plan that I drew up on Photoshop. I started by drawing radial lines from the center of the circle. Then I erased some of the lines so that the design wasn't so predictable. And the idea with the shaded in areas is that I was going to try and create a little variety, but I didn't end up following through on that plan because the grain of the wood ended up providing the variety that it needed. I scaled up the drawing by taping some pieces of paper to the front of the dresser. And I marked out where the drawers are relative to the pattern. And then I drew the pattern onto the piece of paper. And if you don't have a compass large enough, you can always use a piece of string with your pencil and a thumbtack. And I used a printout of the original plan to act as a guide to decide where the lines should go. I numbered all the mosaic pieces on the plan, and then I transferred those to the pieces on the pattern. I want to leave a 1/4 of an inch space between each pattern piece, so I use my ruler to draw an 1/8 of an inch on either side of the central line. Then I simply cut out all of the numbered pattern pieces. I want each mosaic piece to be half the thickness of a 1x, and I have about a 6-inch clearance on my bandsaw, so I used 1x6 pine. The resulting thickness is about 3/8 of an inch, slightly less if you take into account the thickness of the blade. I traced the pattern pieces onto the resawed wood and paid attention to the most efficient use of the material without considering which direction the grain was running. After the tracing, I transferred the number from the pattern piece onto the actual piece of wood so that I could remember where it goes in the pattern. I took note of the number on the pattern piece before sanding it. And wrote it on the edge of the piece when I was finished. Only the fully circular piece was larger than 6 inches in its shortest dimension, so I cut that by hand. I had to keep rotating the piece so that the vise couldn't squeeze the blade between the two pieces of wood when I got to the middle. Once the pieces were cut, I laid them out on their corresponding drawers and then took each set from each drawer outside to do the final sanding and to sand off that number that I'd written on the edge. I hadn't anticipated that the wood was thin enough that when I put glue on the backside that it would expand the wood while the dry side would remain the same size, and so it cupped toward the dry side. Fortunately, I discovered it before the glue was completely dry, and I was able to put some more glue in there and then clamp the piece down. When the mosaic pieces were all in place, I decided to lay out the locations for my drawer hardware, which I just wanted to be very simple cylinders of wood, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first I made a new leg assembly with a more modern look that lifted the dresser off the floor. I like to reuse wood wherever I can, and I made this leg assembly from wood that had been a chair rail in my dining room. If you're enjoying this video, please click like, but more importantly, click subscribe. It's easy to do, it's free for you, and all it means is that you'll get notification when I've got a new video up. I really appreciate all the people who've subscribed already. Thanks very much. I want very simple drawer pulls, so I used this 1-inch dowel. It's actually, I think, an old curtain rail, so it's not exactly an inch thick, but I cut off 3/4 inch pieces and then modified them. I drilled a 1-inch hole through this 1x scrap piece of lumber, but because the actual dowel itself wasn't quite an inch thick, I needed to wedge it in there so that the orbital sander didn't send it spinning. When the first side is sanded flush with the 1x, I put a washer in the bottom of the hole, put the piece back in and wedged it in place, and so the final depth of it was less than 3/4 of an inch. I clamped the same jig onto my drill press and centered it underneath the drill. I wedged the blank into the jig, but before I did that, I put a piece of string under it so that I could get the drawer pull out after I had drilled it. Once the glue on the pegs is dry, I put them in the drill press and make the subtle changes to the blanks that I want with a file. This dimple around the edge of the pull will make it easier to grip. I use a stain and polyurethane all in one, and sometimes pine doesn't absorb it evenly. So I found that if I use clear polyurethane as the first coat, that the subsequent stained coats spread more evenly. I tested out two new stains. The redder one at the bottom is called Traditional Cherry, and the one that I'm applying here is called Early American. I used the darker color in the spaces between the mosaic pieces to emphasize the depth and the shadows, and I used the redder color for the rest of it. In the end, I applied 3 coats. I have a lot of fun making these videos. If you enjoy watching them, please subscribe. And click on the link to my last video. It documents an equally dramatic transformation. Danny wants to thank you for watching too.